A quiet morning, the brewing storm. The sun rose slowly over the sleepy town of Maplewood, casting golden light over its narrow streets and vintage storefronts. Maplewood had always been a place of contrasts, a quaint town where old-fashioned charm masked the quiet hum of long-held tensions. For most, it was just another Sunday morning. But for Joe Carter, an 83-year-old retired Army medic, this day marked a small but significant break in his routine. Joe had spent most of his life in Maplewood, and while he loved its historic charm and slower pace, he had never been blind to the barriers quietly placed in front of people like him. The black man born in the Deep South during a time when segregation and open hostility were facts of life, Joe had learned resilience early. His father had been a sharecropper, and his mother, a midwife who often worked for little more than gratitude. They had taught Joe the value of dignity, even when the world around him sought to deny it. Now retired, Joe's days were simple, filled with books, gardening, and occasional walks around the neighborhood. On Sundays, he treated himself to breakfast at a local diner, one of the few places where the staff knew his name and treated him kindly. But today, his regular spot was closed for renovations, forcing him to consider a different option. He'd heard about Hazel's Café, an upscale diner that promised Southern comfort with a gourmet twist. The reviews were glowing, and locals often boasted about its perfectly brewed coffee and fluffy pancakes. But there was also an unspoken understanding in town. Hazel's wasn't a place that welcomed everyone. Joe hesitated as he stood in front of his modest home, adjusting his military-issue jacket, which bore the medals he'd earned during his 22 years of service. Why not? He muttered to himself, determination hardening his features. Hazel's might be known for its exclusivity, but Joe had fought for his country, patched up wounded soldiers under enemy fire, and risked his life countless times. He deserved the same respect and service as anyone else. The cafe stood at the corner of Main Street, its cheerful green awning and flower boxes suggesting warmth and hospitality. Joe approached the entrance with deliberate steps, his cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement. As he opened the door, a small brass bell jingled, announcing his arrival. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon greeted him, momentarily softening his apprehension. The cafe was busy but not overcrowded. Families chatted over stacks of pancakes, couples sipped coffee in cozy booths, and a group of bikers occupied a corner table, their leather jackets and rugged demeanor adding an unexpected energy to the room. Job noticed the absence of anyone who looked like him, but he shrugged it off. He had long ago stopped expecting to see himself reflected in such spaces. "Good morning, sir." A young waitress with a bright smile and curly blonde hair approached him. Her name tag read Maddie. "Would you like a table or a seat at the counter?" Joe smiled back, his face creased with age but warm. "A table, if you have one. By the window, maybe." "Of course. Follow me." Maddie led him to a small booth near the front window, offering a view of the bustling street outside. Joe lowered himself into the seat with care, his joints stiff from years of wear. As Maddie handed him a menu, he noticed her kindness was genuine, an increasingly rare quality. "I'll get you a coffee to start. Black, or do you take cream and sugar?" "Black, thank you," Joe replied, his voice deep and steady. As Maddie walked away, Joe began perusing the menu. Everything looked delicious, but he couldn't help but notice the high prices. Still, he decided he'd splurge just this once. He deserved it. The cafe owner, a man named Frank Ralston, emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of steaming plates. He was stocky, with a bald head that gleamed under the warm lights. His presence commanded attention, and Joe immediately felt the shift in the atmosphere. Frank's eyes scanned the room, his expression one of satisfaction, until they landed on Joe. Frank froze mid-step, his smile faltering. His eyes narrowed as he took in Joe's presence, lingering on the medals on his jacket. The expression on his face shifted from surprise to something colder, more hostile. He set the tray down at a nearby table and disappeared back into the kitchen. Joe noticed the reaction but said nothing. He had been in enough similar situations to know what was likely coming. Still, he sipped his coffee, enjoying its rich, bold flavor. Maddie returned with a notebook in hand. "Ready to order, sir. I'll have the scrambled eggs, bacon, and a side of grits, please." The cafe owner, a man named Frank Ralston, emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of steaming plates. He was stocky, with a bald head that gleamed under the warm lights. His presence commanded attention, and Joe immediately felt the shift in the atmosphere. Frank's eyes scanned the room, his expression one of satisfaction, until they landed on Joe. Frank froze mid-step, his smile faltering. His eyes narrowed as he took in Joe's presence, lingering on the medals on his jacket. The expression on his face shifted from surprise to something colder, more hostile. He set the tray down at a nearby table and disappeared back into the kitchen. Joe noticed the reaction but said nothing. He had been in enough similar situations to know what was likely coming. Still, he sipped his coffee, enjoying its rich, bold flavor. Maddie returned with a notebook in hand. "Ready to order, sir. I'll have the scrambled eggs, bacon, and a side of grits, please." "Great choice. I'll get that in for you." As Maddie headed back to the kitchen, Joe leaned back in his seat and watched the town come to life through the window. The tension he'd sensed earlier lingered, but he tried to focus on the small joys: the laughter of children at a nearby table, the pleasant hum of conversation, and the aroma of good food. Minutes later, the kitchen door swung open, and Frank marched toward Joe's table, his face set in a scowl. Joe straightened, his instincts sharpened by years of military discipline. "Sir, I think you've made a mistake," Frank said, his voice low but firm. "We're full up today. You'll need to leave." Joe blinked, confused. "Full? There are empty tables all around." Frank's jaw tightened. "We reserve the right to refuse service." The room grew quiet. Patrons stopped mid-conversation, their eyes darting between Frank and Joe. Maddie stood frozen near the counter, her face pale with embarrassment. Joe felt the familiar weight of humiliation pressing on his chest, but he refused to let it show. "Sir," Joe said calmly, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had... The two men exchanged a look of mutual respect, a silent understanding born of shared sacrifice. Mike turned back to Frank, his stance unwavering. "Listen, pal," Mike said, his voice hardening. "This man earned the right to sit wherever the hell he wants. If you can't see that, maybe you don't deserve to run a place like this." Frank bristled, his composure slipping further. "I don't need a lecture from some washed-up biker. This is my cafe, and I make the rules." Mike opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, one of the bikers still seated in the corner stood up. He was younger than Mike, with tattoos snaking up his arms and a sharp intensity in his eyes. "Frank," the younger biker said, his voice low but carrying an edge that silenced the room further. "You're making a mistake." Frank glared at him. "Stay out of this, Jared." Jared shook his head, his expression unreadable. "You know what my dad always told me. The way you treat people says more about you than it does about them. Right now, you're saying a lot about yourself." The words hit their mark, and for a brief moment, Frank faltered, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and jabbed a finger toward the door. "This isn't up for debate. He's leaving. Now." Joe sighed, the sound heavy with years of experience. He stepped forward, his movements slow but deliberate. "It's all right," he said softly, addressing Mike and Jared. "I'm not here to cause trouble." Mike frowned. "You're not the one causing trouble." Joe met his gaze. "Maybe not, but I've learned when to pick my battles." As Joe turned to leave, the weight of the situation settled heavily on his shoulders. He had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that the world had moved past such moments, that his years of service and sacrifice might have earned him the simple dignity of being treated like any other customer. But here he was again, reminded that some battles never truly ended. Just as Joe reached the door, a voice cut through the tense silence. "Wait." It was Maddie, the young waitress who had greeted Joe with such warmth earlier. She stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly but her voice steady. "Mr. Ralston, this isn't right." Frank turned on her, his expression incredulous. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Maddie said, her cheeks flushing but her resolve unwavering. "This man hasn't done anything wrong. You can't just kick him out because you don't like the way he looks." Frank's face darkened. "You're out of line, Maddie. You don't tell me how to run my business. And you don't get to treat people like they're less than human." She shot back, her voice rising with emotion. "Not here. Not in this town." The room buzzed with murmurs as the other patrons absorbed her words. Some nodded in agreement, their earlier silence giving way to quiet support. Others remained passive, their discomfort evident, but their reluctance to act palpable. Frank's jaw tightened. "If you don't like how I run things, you're free to leave. Permanently." Maddie hesitated, the weight of her decision clear on her face. Joe watched her, admiration mixing with concern. He had seen courage like this before, in young soldiers who stood their ground against insurmountable odds, in medics who risked their lives to save others. But he also knew the cost such bravery often carried. Before Maddie could respond, Mike stepped in. "She's not going anywhere. And neither is Joe." Frank opened his mouth to argue, but the sound of a chair scraping against the floor interrupted him. One by one, the bikers rose from their table, their presence looming large in the small cafe. Jared stepped forward, his expression cold and unyielding. "We're all staying," he said. "And if you've got a problem with that, you can call the cops. Let's see how that works out for you." Frank's eyes flickered with uncertainty. He looked around the room, noticing that the tide of opinion had turned against him. Even the patrons who had initially supported him now seemed uneasy, their expressions conflicted. Joe spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "I didn't come here to cause a scene. I just wanted breakfast. But if my presence here offends you so deeply, I'll go. I've dealt with worse than this." His words were measured, but they carried a quiet power that silenced the room. For a moment, it seemed as though he might leave, taking the high road as he had so many times before. But then Maddie stepped closer, her chin lifted defiantly. "No, sir," she said. "You're staying. If anyone should leave, it's him." She pointed at Frank, her gaze unflinching. The cafe erupted into murmurs, and Frank's face turned a deep shade of red. He sputtered, trying to regain control of the situation, but the momentum had shifted. Mike clapped a hand on Joe's shoulder. "You've earned your place here, Joe. Don't let this idiot tell you otherwise." Jared nodded. "He's right. You stay. We'll make sure of it." Joe looked around the room, at the faces of strangers who had chosen to stand with him, and felt a rare sense of hope. Perhaps the world hadn't changed as much as he'd wished, but moments like this reminded him that progress, however slow, was still possible. As Frank stormed back into the kitchen, muttering under his breath, Joe sat back down in his booth. Maddie returned to his side, her hand still trembling but her smile unwavering. "Your breakfast is on the house, Mr. Carter," she said softly. "It's the least we can do." Joe smiled, the lines on his face softening. "Thank you, Maddie. And please, call me Joe." As the cafe returned to a semblance of normalcy, Joe took a sip of his coffee, savoring its warmth. The battle wasn't over. Not in this cafe, not in Maplewood, and not in the world. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace, surrounded by unexpected allies, and the quiet strength of his own dignity. A community divided. The tension in Hazel's cafe lingered like the aftermath of a storm. Though the bikers had returned to their corner table, and most patrons had resumed their meals, an undeniable shift had taken place. Joe Carter remained in his booth, sipping his coffee, his back straight, and his expression composed. Maddie, the waitress, bustled nervously between tables, her usual cheer tempered by the confrontation that had unfolded moments ago. Frank Ralston, the cafe owner, stood behind the counter, arms crossed and face set in a scowl. From his post, he surveyed the room like a general on a battlefield, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. For Frank, the incident was not merely about Joe's presence, but a challenge to his authority, a challenge he wasn't used to facing. Joe, meanwhile, tried to focus on the comforting aroma of his breakfast, now being prepared in the kitchen. The soft clatter of dishes and the occasional hiss of the griddle were small reminders of normalcy, but he couldn't ignore the whispers around him. Conversations that had once been mundane, about the weather, church sermons, or plans for the afternoon, now carried an edge, fractured by what had occurred. At a table near the window, two elderly women spoke in hushed tones. "Can you believe that man just walked in here like he owned the place?" One of them muttered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the cafe. Her companion, more cautious, glanced toward Joe. "He didn't do anything wrong. And those medals on his jacket. He's a veteran. For heaven's sake. That doesn't mean he can just..." "Just what?" The second woman interrupted, her voice sharpening. "Sit down and have breakfast like anyone else." The first woman fell silent, her cheeks reddening as she toyed with the napkin in her lap. At another table, a young couple debated in low voices. The man leaned closer to his partner, his brows furrowed. "I don't get why Frank made such a big deal. The guy wasn't causing trouble." "It's not that simple," the woman replied, her tone hesitant. "Frank's got a reputation to protect. This is a small town. People talk." "Yeah, and what they're saying now isn't exactly flattering," the man countered, gesturing subtly toward the bikers. "Look at them. You think they're coming back after this?" The woman didn't respond, her expression clouded with uncertainty. In the corner, Mike and Jared, the bikers who had come to Joe's defense, exchanged glances. Their companions, a mix of younger and older men, remained quiet, though their postures conveyed solidarity. Jared broke the silence. "We should have done more," he said, his voice low but firm. "That guy deserved better." Mike shook his head. "We did enough. Pushed too hard, and Frank would have called the cops. This way, Joe got to stay, and Frank knows we're watching." Jared frowned, his jaw tightening. "It's not enough." Mike sighed, his gaze shifting to Joe, who was stirring sugar into his coffee. "It never is, kid, but it's a start." Back at Joe's table, Maddie approached with a plate of food, her steps careful and deliberate. She set the plate down gently, the scrambled eggs, bacon, and grits arranged with care. "There you go, Mr. Carter," she said softly, her smile tentative. "I hope you enjoy it." Joe looked up at her, his expression softening. "Thank you, Maddie. And please, call me Joe." She nodded, hesitating for a moment before speaking again. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what happened earlier. You didn't deserve that." Joe studied her for a moment, his dark eyes kind but discerning. "Thank you," he said simply. "It takes courage to stand up for what's right. You did good, Maddie." Her cheeks flushed, and she glanced around nervously. "Not everyone agrees with me." "They don't have to," Joe replied. "But you'll sleep better at night, knowing you did the right thing." Maddie smiled faintly and returned to her duties, leaving Joe to his meal. He took a bite of the eggs, their creamy texture and rich flavor momentarily distracting him from the tension in the room. But as he ate, his thoughts wandered, drawn back to the countless times he'd faced similar situations. Joe's mind traveled back to his younger years, to a diner in Alabama where he had been denied service while wearing the same uniform he now proudly displayed. He remembered the sting of rejection, the humiliation of being told he wasn't welcome, even as he fought for the freedoms others took for granted. Yet even then, he hadn't backed down. He had stayed, his quiet presence a form of protest. Now, decades later, the same fight played out in a different setting. The faces had changed, the circumstances slightly altered, but the underlying struggle remained. Joe wondered how many more battles like this he would witness before his time was up. The cafe door jingled as a new patron entered, a middle-aged woman with a confident stride and a sharp gaze. She wore a tailored blazer and carried a leather briefcase, her presence immediately commanding attention. Maddie greeted her with a polite smile. "Good morning. Table for one." The woman's eyes swept the room, landing briefly on Joe before returning to Maddie. "Actually, I'm here to speak with Frank Ralston." Maddie's smile faltered. "Oh, he's behind the counter." The woman nodded and made her way to Frank, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She leaned against the counter, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. Ralston, I'm Natalie Harper. I run the local Veterans Outreach Program. I heard there was an incident here this morning." Frank stiffened, his expression darkening. "It's been handled." "Handled?" Natalie's eyebrow arched. "From what I've been told, you attempted to kick out a decorated veteran for no reason other than the color of his skin. Is that correct?" Frank's jaw tightened. "This is my business. I don't need to explain myself to you or anyone else." Natalie's smile was razor-sharp. "Actually, you do, because as of this moment, I'm filing a formal complaint with the Better Business Bureau and notifying the local media." The cafe buzzed with whispers, the patrons riveted by the confrontation. Frank's face turned a deep shade of red, and his fists clenched at his sides. "You're blowing this out of proportion," he said through gritted teeth. "That man doesn't even live here. He's just stirring up trouble." "Mr. Ralston," Natalie said, her voice icy, "that man fought for this country. He risked his life for people like you. And you think he's the one stirring up trouble?" Frank opened his mouth to respond, but Natalie held up a hand, silencing him. "This isn't just about Joe Carter. It's about what kind of town we want Maplewood to be. Inclusive, or stuck in the past." Joe watched the exchange with quiet interest, his fork pausing midair. He hadn't expected an ally like Natalie to appear, but he was grateful nonetheless. Her words carried a force he hadn't been able to muster alone, and he felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, this town could change. As Natalie continued to speak, the room seemed to shift. Some patrons nodded in agreement, their initial reluctance giving way to quiet support. Others looked uncomfortable, their faces betraying their internal conflict. Even Maddie seemed emboldened, her steps lighter as she refilled coffee cups and cleared plates. Joe took another sip of his coffee, the warmth spreading through him. For the first time that morning, he allowed himself a small smile. The fight wasn't over, but for now, he could savor this moment, a small victory in a lifetime of battles. A fire ignited. Natalie Harper's words continued to echo through the cafe, her unwavering conviction lighting a fire that began to spread. The patrons, initially reluctant to take a stance, were now forced to confront their own values. Joe Carter, still seated in his booth, observed the unfolding scene with a mixture of quiet dignity and cautious hope. Frank Ralston, the cafe owner, stood rigid behind the counter, his face a deep crimson. He was unaccustomed to being challenged, especially in his own establishment. The weight of Natalie's pointed remarks and the murmurs of the other patrons bore down on him, but his pride wouldn't allow him to relent so easily. "I don't need a lecture about how to run my business," Frank snapped, his voice breaking the tense silence. "If people don't like it, they can take their breakfast somewhere else." Natalie's expression didn't waver. She leaned forward, her tone measured but sharp enough to cut through the rising noise. "Frank, I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here to make it clear that actions have consequences. You're not just risking your reputation. You're risking the livelihood of your employees, the trust of your customers, and the standing of this community." Her words sent ripples through the cafe. Maddie, the young waitress who had bravely stood up for Joe earlier, stood near the kitchen door, gripping her tray tightly. Her gaze darted between Natalie and Frank, a mix of admiration and apprehension in her eyes. The bikers in the corner exchanged glances, their body language a silent show of support for Natalie's stance. Meanwhile, Joe sat quietly, his gaze fixed on his untouched plate of food. Though his stomach growled with hunger, his mind churned with memories. He thought back to his service days, to the camaraderie he had shared with men of all backgrounds, bound together by the singular purpose of survival. The battlefield had stripped away prejudices, revealing the humanity beneath. Yet here, in a peaceful town he had once hoped to retire in harmony, old wounds were reopened. Mike, the biker who had first stepped up in Joe's defense, approached his table and sat down uninvited. The leather of his jacket creaked as he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You all right, Joe?" Mike asked, his gravelly voice softened with concern. Joe nodded slowly. "I've been through worse." Mike chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "I'm sure you have. But that doesn't mean you should have to keep dealing with this kind of crap." Joe tilted his head, studying the man across from him. Mike's weathered face told its own story of battles fought and hardships endured. "You didn't have to step in," Joe said after a moment. "But I'm glad you did." Mike shrugged. "It's what you do. Stand up for what's right." At the counter, Jared, the younger biker, was watching Frank intently. His fists were clenched, his jaw tight, as if barely containing his frustration. "This isn't over," he muttered to one of his companions. "Guys like Frank only get away with this because no one calls them out." One of the older bikers, a man with graying hair and a calm demeanor, placed a hand on Jared's shoulder. "Patience," he said. "We've already made our point. Let's see how it plays out." Jared shook his head. "Patience doesn't fix anything. Action does." The cafe door jingled again, and this time it wasn't a customer entering but a local journalist. A petite woman with a camera slung over her shoulder and a notepad in hand stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. She spotted Natalie and made a beeline for her. "Natalie," the journalist said, her voice brisk. "I got your message. What's going on?" Natalie gestured toward Joe. This gentleman, Joe Carter, a decorated Army medic, was nearly thrown out of this cafe for no reason other than the color of his skin. The journalist's eyes widened, and she immediately turned to Joe. "Mr. Carter, would you mind if I ask you a few questions?" Joe hesitated, his instinct for privacy clashing with the realization that his story might carry more weight if shared. "I'm not sure my story will change anything," he said finally. "But if it helps others, I'm willing to talk." The journalist nodded, her pen poised above her notepad. "That's exactly what stories like yours do. They help people see what needs to change." As the interview began, the patrons of the cafe listened intently. Some leaned in, their curiosity piqued by Joe's calm recounting of his experiences. Others shifted uncomfortably, clearly uneasy with the scrutiny now placed on their town. The bikers, Maddie, and even Natalie watched with a mixture of pride and anticipation. Frank, however, was seething. He slammed a coffee pot onto the counter, causing a few startled patrons to flinch. "This is a circus," he muttered under his breath. Natalie turned to him, her expression sharp. "It's accountability, Frank. Something you've been avoiding for far too long." As the interview wrapped up, Joe's voice carried across the cafe. "I didn't come here looking for trouble. I came here for breakfast. But if my presence is a problem, then the problem isn't me. It's how you see me." The cafe fell silent once more, Joe's words hanging heavy in the air. Even Frank seemed momentarily at a loss for words, his bluster deflated by the quiet strength of Joe's statement. Outside, the journalist snapped a few photos of the cafe, the story already forming in her mind. Maddie stepped out behind her, taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air. She turned to Joe, who had followed her out after finishing his meal. "Mr. Carter," she said hesitantly, "I just wanted to say thank you for your service. For everything." Joe smiled gently. "And thank you, Maddie. It's young people like you who give me hope for the future." As the cafe bustled behind them, the seeds of change were already taking root. What had begun as a quiet Sunday morning had transformed into a catalyst for reflection, for action, and for the possibility of a better future in Maplewood. Cracks in the facade. The air outside Hazel's Café had grown crisp as the sun climbed higher, bathing Maplewood in a light that felt oddly stark. Inside, however, the atmosphere remained tense. Conversations flickered and faltered, fueled by the quiet buzz of what had just occurred. Joe Carter's quiet defiance, Natalie Harper's pointed words, and the unexpected presence of a journalist had turned an ordinary breakfast into an extraordinary confrontation. Joe sat in his booth, finishing the last bite of his now cold breakfast. His steady demeanor belied the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. Across the room, Maddie stole glances at him while refilling coffee cups and taking orders. The young waitress looked more determined than ever, her earlier nervousness replaced by resolve. Frank Ralston, the cafe owner, had retreated to the kitchen, his face a mask of frustration. There, he paced back and forth, his anger bubbling to the surface as he muttered to himself. "They're ruining my business," he hissed, slamming a spatula onto the counter. "A bunch of outsiders telling me how to run my cafe." One of the kitchen staff, a middle-aged cook named Roy, exchanged a glance with his younger colleague, Maria. They had worked at Hazel's for years, and while Frank's temper was nothing new, his behavior today was different, uglier, more volatile. Maria hesitated before speaking. "Frank, maybe you should apologize, just to smooth things over." Frank spun toward her, his eyes blazing. "Apologize? For what?" "For standing my ground, for keeping this place respectable." Roy shook his head, wiping his hands on his apron. "You're not keeping it respectable, Frank. You're running it into the ground." Frank's glare shifted to Roy. "You've got no idea what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Roy shot back, his voice low but firm. "You've got a room full of people watching you act like a bully. Is that the legacy you want?" Frank didn't respond, but the tension in his posture spoke volumes. Maria and Roy exchanged another glance before returning to their tasks, leaving Frank to stew in his anger. Back in the dining area, the journalist, Emily Grayson, had taken a seat near Joe, reviewing her notes. The room was quieter now, the earlier drama leaving a lingering unease among the patrons. Some had already left, muttering about the disruption, while others stayed, their curiosity outweighing their discomfort. Joe glanced at Emily, his gaze thoughtful. "You think people will care about this story?" he'd asked. Emily looked up, startled by the question. "Of course they will. Your story isn't just about today. It's about everything you've lived through. People need to hear it." Joe nodded slowly, though his expression remained skeptical. "I've seen a lot of stories come and go. People care for a moment, then move on. Doesn't change much." Emily leaned forward, her voice quiet but insistent. "Change takes time, and sometimes it starts with one voice. Your voice." Joe's lips twitched into a faint smile. "You're persistent. I'll give you that." "It's my job," Emily replied with a grin. "And it's worth it." Meanwhile, Mike and Jared, the bikers who had stood up for Joe earlier, were deep in conversation at their table. Jared's frustration was palpable, his fingers tapping restlessly against the edge of his coffee cup. "This town's got problems," Jared muttered. "And Frank's just the tip of the iceberg." Mike nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're not wrong, but change doesn't happen overnight." Jared leaned forward, his voice low but intense. "So what do we do? Just sit back and wait?" "No," Mike replied firmly. "We keep pushing, one step at a time." Jared's eyes flicked toward Joe. "He's got guts. Standing up like that. Makes me wonder how many others have stories like his, just waiting to be heard." Mike followed his gaze, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "More than you think, kid. More than you think." As Frank stepped back, the room exhaled, the tension easing ever so slightly. Joe looked around at the faces watching him, some curious, some supportive, some still hesitant. He offered a small, dignified smile. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a long time, Joe felt the faint stirrings of hope. Change had begun, and for today, that was enough. The spark of change. The cafe buzzed with a strange new energy, a hum of possibilities that hadn't been present that morning. Joe Carter sat in his booth, his breakfast long finished, but he made no move to leave. The weight of the day's events hung heavy in the air, yet beneath it lay a faint sense of accomplishment. Around him, the room was alive with murmurs, quiet nods, and conversations spurred by his presence. Frank Ralston had retreated to the kitchen after his public apology, leaving his staff to handle the cafe while he gathered his thoughts. Maddie, the young waitress who had stood up for Joe earlier, moved with purpose, her confidence bolstered by the support she had witnessed. The bikers in the corner, now joined by a few more friends, remained a quiet but watchful presence, their solidarity unmistakable. Joe leaned back in his booth, his hands resting on his cane. He gazed out the window, watching the world go by. Young couples strolling hand in hand, families laughing, and elderly neighbors chatting on the sidewalk. The scene was peaceful, a stark contrast to the tension that had gripped the cafe just an hour earlier. Yet, as tranquil as it seemed, Joe knew the true work had only just begun. Curtis Williams, the contractor who had introduced himself earlier, slid into the seat across from Joe without waiting for an invitation. Joe raised an eyebrow, amused by the younger man's boldness. "Mind some company?" Curtis asked with a grin. Joe chuckled softly. "I suppose I don't." Curtis leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "I've been thinking about what happened here today. It's not just about this cafe, you know. It's about this whole town." Joe nodded slowly. "You're not wrong. But towns like this don't change overnight." "Maybe not," Curtis said. "But they don't change at all if nobody speaks up. What you did today, that was a spark. And sparks can catch fire." Joe tilted his head, studying Curtis. "What are you getting at?" Curtis's grin widened. "I'm saying we need to keep this momentum going. What if we organize something? A community meeting, maybe. Get people talking about what needs to change." Joe's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "You think folks around here are ready for that?" "They might surprise you," Curtis replied. "Look at today. People stood up, maybe not everyone, but enough to make a difference." Joe tapped his fingers against the table, considering the idea. After a moment, he nodded. "All right, let's give it a shot." By the time the cafe began to clear out, word of the incident had spread throughout Maplewood. Some residents were outraged by Frank's behavior, while others dismissed it as overblown. But for many, the story sparked conversations that had long been avoided, about race, respect, and the kind of community they wanted to be. That evening, Curtis followed through on his promise, posting flyers around town and spreading the word on social media about a community forum to address local issues. Joe agreed to be a guest speaker, though he approached the idea with cautious optimism. He had spent his life quietly fighting battles, but the idea of standing before a crowd and sharing his story felt daunting. The day of the forum arrived quickly. The event was held in the town hall, a modest building that had seen countless gatherings over the years. Town meetings, wedding receptions, even the occasional talent show. But tonight, the room felt different, charged with anticipation. Joe arrived early, dressed in his usual neatly pressed slacks and button-down shirt. His military jacket, adorned with his medals, was a silent testament to the life he had lived. As he stepped inside, he was greeted by Curtis and Maddie, both of whom looked equal parts excited and nervous. "You ready for this?" Curtis asked, clapping Joe on the shoulder. Joe chuckled softly. "I've faced tougher crowds." As the room filled, Joe scanned the faces in the audience. There were families, young couples, and seniors like himself. He noticed Mike and Jared sitting together near the back, their presence a reassuring reminder of the allies he had gained. Natalie Harper, the Veterans Outreach Director, was seated near the front, her sharp gaze scanning the crowd. When it was time to speak, Curtis introduced Joe with a short, heartfelt speech. The applause that followed was warm but hesitant, the audience unsure of what to expect. Joe rose slowly, using his cane for support, and made his way to the podium. For a moment, he stood silently, his dark eyes sweeping the room. The murmurs quieted, and the audience leaned forward, waiting. "I've lived a long life," Joe began, his voice steady but quiet. 83 years. In that time, I've seen a lot: war, peace, progress, and setbacks. I've fought battles on foreign soil, and I've fought battles right here at home. And let me tell you, the hardest battles aren't the ones fought with weapons. They're the ones fought with words, with actions, and with hearts. The room was silent, his words hanging heavy in the air. What happened at Hazel's Café the other day? That wasn't new. It wasn't surprising. But what happened after? That was something I haven't seen enough of in my lifetime. People stood up. People spoke out. And that gives me hope. Joe paused, his gaze moving across the room. Change isn't easy. It's not quick. But it starts with conversations like this. It starts with each of us deciding what kind of town, what kind of world we want to live in. The applause that followed was louder, more confident. Joe stepped back from the podium, nodding to Curtis as he returned to his seat. The forum continued late into the evening, with residents sharing their thoughts, fears, and hopes. Frank Ralston, who had reluctantly agreed to attend, sat quietly in the back, his expression unreadable. When it was his turn to speak, he rose hesitantly, the weight of his earlier actions evident in his posture. "I want to start by saying I'm sorry," Frank said, his voice rough. "To Mr. Carter, to my staff, and to this community. I made a mistake, and I know words aren't enough, but I'm committed to making things right." The audience reacted with a mix of applause and skepticism, but Frank's presence alone was a step forward. As the forum ended, Joe lingered in the hall, shaking hands and exchanging quiet words with attendees. Maddie approached him, her eyes shining with admiration. "You were amazing, Joe," she said. "I think you really got through to people." Joe smiled gently. "Maybe. But the real work starts tomorrow." Maddie nodded, her expression serious. "Then we better get to it." That night, as Joe walked home under the soft glow of the streetlights, he felt a strange mix of exhaustion and hope. The road ahead would be long, and there would be setbacks. But for the first time in a long time, he believed that change was possible. And for Joe Carter, that was more than enough.